I'm joined by Dr. Sasha Gusev of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Harvard Medical School, where he is an assistant professor. Sasha's lab develops statistical methods to study the genetic causes of cancer and identify novel cancer mechanisms. This work involves large-scale clinical and genomic data sets and phenotypes from hundreds of thousands of patients across many institutions. He's engaged in ongoing collaborations with us to empower secure genomic analyses for disease cohorts and clinical trials. Today, we're going to talk about a solution we worked on together, which leverages homomorphic encryption to perform large-scale genome-wide association studies on encrypted genetic data, and how we yielded results 30 times faster than alternative state-of-the-art methods. Sasha, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Ronen. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about this technology.
So to jump right into it, what we'd like to do is give the audience an overview of what it is that we actually did and some of the privacy considerations and the solution. And then once we give a good understanding of what's available today, it would be great to hear your vision for the future, for the technology and where this can go. So to kick off, could you maybe describe the problem we were solving in the project that we did?
Yeah, happy to. So the fundamental question that we wanted to ask and that we are seeking in this field in general is what are the genetic causes of cancer and cancer risk? In other words, what are genetic variants or mutations or genes that either increase the probability or decrease the probability that somebody will develop cancer? And once we identify those, we can stratify high-risk patients and we can develop potential drugs. And so the way that we do that is collect data from a very, very large number of individuals and simply evaluate whether a genetic variant is at a higher frequency in the people who have the disease versus the people who don't. So the statistics underlying this are all very simple, but fundamentally it requires data from hundreds of thousands or millions of patients to be able to make these discoveries.
And so, I can infer and assume why privacy would be needed if you're talking about genetic data, but can you maybe give a little bit of color onto why this is a challenge and why it's important to protect privacy?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I think it's probably clear that genetic data is extremely sensitive. People are concerned about how something that they are born with and have for life may be used in various studies. The clinical data here is also very sensitive. It's oftentimes electronic health records from hospitals or medical institutions. And again, there's a concern about how that can be used, what specifically will be used for. And then I think the other challenge here is really a logistical one. Most of these studies require work across multiple institutions. No single hospital is seeing the number of patients that we need to do this kind of analysis. And cross-institutional collaborations are very challenging. There's a lot of competing interests, and there's also a lot of legal frameworks that need to be set up to make them work. And I think that actually the logistics of just being able to work across institutions held back a lot of these studies from what they could be. Interesting.
So what's the solution then? Because this sounds like a mess, right? You have to balance competing interests, type of data, use of data, and still get insights out of it, right? So how do you solve the problem?
Yeah, so I think why I thought this was such a transformative technology is that the work with Duality focused on homomorphic encryption, and essentially the idea there is to sidestep the question of how do you share the underlying sensitive data, and instead develop a technique to work on encrypted data without having to release any of the sensitive information at all. And because the fundamental goal of this study is to understand biology, it's to understand genetic events rather than to sort of dig into the individual patient data. This solution was very effective. Instead of trying to work out how to have multiple institutions be able to collaborate equitably, we just figure out how to do the statistics without releasing any of the underlying data.
Interesting. And so today already you're running statistical analyses on disparate and I guess linked encrypted data sets, right? So if that's what's possible today, where do you see this going in the future?
Yeah, I think that what we were able to show in this paper in PNAS that that was the focus of this collaboration is that we could do scalable genomic analyses on hundreds of thousands of individuals in a privacy preserving way. But we showed that on phenotypes that were fundamentally static, like do you have the disease or not? Do you have the mutation or not? Where I see this going in the future is much richer phenotypes that correspond to the time it takes for you to develop the disease, certain drug or therapy worked for you or how well it worked for you. So much more complex and dynamic phenotypes. And I think actually that those are the phenotypes that have more potential clinical utility. And in particular, applying these kinds of approaches to clinical trials where what is typically collected is how well a drug worked and for how long. It is very important because that clinical trial data is even more sensitive than the sort of cohort analyses that I described earlier. There's a lot of corporate competition, and there's a lot of influence from the results from a clinical trial and whether a drug gets approved or not. And so being able to work with the complex phenotypes that are in trials while still ensuring privacy, I think that's the next big challenge.
Interesting. So it's more complex data and more complex use cases at the end of the day. And I think that actually starts to touch my last question for you is, how does performance fit into this? Does performance open up those opportunities? And what new or novel things can you do with the technology if you can address performance?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple angles on which performance and scalability is really important. So the first is just the practical point that over the coming years, a very large fraction of the population is going to have genomic data of some sort. There are millions of people getting genotyped through direct-to-consumer studies, products like 23andMe. There's also national efforts by the NIH and by the British healthcare system to collect data from large biobanks. And what we have seen in these studies is that the more samples, the more people you can incorporate, the more discoveries you can make. And that hasn't changed. Like, we are not hitting diminishing returns. We can definitely identify more biomarkers from larger populations. So continuing to scale to millions of individuals rather than just hundreds of thousands, I think is going to be critical. The other side of it, which I actually think has not been explored very well, is working with studies that are more dynamic in the sense that the data is collected in a sort of crowdsourced way where individual patients can learn about a study online and decide to participate in that study. And then maybe later on decide to participate in other studies or control how their data is going to be used for that research. This is not something that's done right now because of these patient privacy concerns. It's not done very frequently, but it is, I think, the future of this kind of research is where every individual can securely contribute to a research analysis that they're interested in. And again, that's going to require algorithms, secure algorithms that are able to scale to a study population that's constantly changing, where people are regularly coming in and out of it. So I think that's something I hope that we can develop in the future.
Interesting. So really, I guess the final message you have is about democratizing data at
Exactly.
the end of the day. Sasha, thank you very much for your time and insights. This has been really wonderful. Really appreciate it and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.